right, good afternoon. How's everyone doing this afternoon? Good, glad to hear it. So I'll give everyone a couple of seconds just to get themselves settled before we get started. So I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Kathleen Grant. I am an assistant professor here at Monmouth University in the educational counseling side. So I wanted to sort of get an idea, I wanted to give you all sort of an idea of what brought me to this topic. And I'd love to hear from a couple of people to understand what brought you all to this session today. So before and during I went for my Ph.D., I was a practicing school counselor in northern New Jersey. I was at high school level, and I was noticing this sort of problematic trend in the students I was working with. So year after year, my office was sort of inundated with students that were dealing with really high rates of anxiety, of depression. A lot of them were medicated. But I also noticed that a lot of the same students were presenting with these challenges, and I conceptualized it around the college admissions process. They were really uber focused on the college admissions process. All of the choices they were making in life were somehow designed to give them sort of a leg up in the process. So in terms of the classes that they were taking, the extracurricular activities that they were involved in. And we're counselors, we're trained, in Erikson, in the developmental stages of adolescence. And I was pretty worried for my students because I said, hey, this is a time of identity development, of you to try on different identities in the world, figure out who you want to be, engage with your peers, because we know too, that's really how one develops identity, right? To understand who they are outside of their family of origin. And I saw a lot of my students were putting that work on hold to follow this sort of prescribed path in terms of, I need to get excellent SAT scores, I need to get a high GPA, I need to be in these activities, I need to be a leader in these activities, and that's it, right? I love languages. I had students that loved world languages, and they would love to just immerse themselves into a couple of world languages. But they wouldn't do that because they wouldn't give them enough credit in terms of their GPA, right? Because they weren't getting like the AP multiplier. So they wouldn't take those classes. They would take a class that they hated instead in order to drive up their GPA. So I was concerned about this. So then through my PhD program, I started diving into the research to understand, was this something that was just happening at my school? Or was this something that was happening universally? Unfortunately, it is something that's happening across the country. It's actually the extreme achievement orientation is considered to be the fourth leading risk factor that's bringing down adolescent well-being. That's bonkers. I mean, that's insane when we think about the first one is poverty, the next one is trauma, and then we look at discrimination and all of the things, and then we have extreme achievement orientation. That's what's driving down adolescent well-being. And then I also I've conducted research, lots of research in this area too. So I'm going to present a little bit today of findings from scholars across the United States, but then also my own research in terms of what's going on with this population. And then hopefully at the end, we'll have some time to engage in a dialogue, and I'd love to hear your experiences with this population and open it up and talk about what you're seeing, what's working, what's not working, so we can have some tools to better serve this population. All right, so I think because of the size, we're not gonna go around and sort of talk about what brought each of us here, but let's start and get rooted in the students themselves and in their voices and what they are telling us as researchers. So this is Eric, who was in the 10th grade when he wrote this. Eric lives in Lexington, Massachusetts. Lexington, Massachusetts is a high-achieving district, school district, and had to put in mandatory programming because there was such a high suicide epidemic, there was such high rates of anxiety due to this achievement orientation they believed. So they put in this special programming for students to express how they're feeling through the arts. And here's what Eric wrote. Clammy hands and a tapping foot, even lying there in bed. The tests and projects and quizzes and projects and tests cannot be forgotten. The endless list of deadlines seems to never stop growing, and the pressure builds up. It builds and it builds and it builds, but the release valve is nearly within reach. There is a pause used to fantasize, about a burden-free life. And during this pause, the pressure swiftly, silently envelops the dreamer to ensure that this dreamer, this naive, hopeful student, will never cease working towards some perverted portrayal of success. So is this what we're hearing these voices repeated, in some of our own professional practices, and then certainly in the scholarly literature? Is this what we hope for our students, right? That this is sort of a normalized experience. Are there any reactions when we read this, when we listen to this, this piece of writing?
Dr. Grant, that sounds like a college student.
Yes, right.
That sounds like me when I was in undergrad, not me when I was in 10th grade.
10th grade,
Yeah,
right, 14, 15 years old.
That's crazy.
Right. So we also think about the lost potential, right? If the student is capable of like this real, evocative writing, and maybe, he's maybe stuck in some of this more desperate place in terms of what's going on with him. Yeah.
But he realizes that last line in some perverted portrayal of success.
Right.
So he realizes that, okay, yeah, this is my experience, but I know there's something not right.
Yes, absolutely. So he's calling sort of BS on it, right? He's saying that this isn't right. But what can often happen with students when they keep receiving messages from their culture that this is right, that voice starts to go away, right? So that little quiet voice starts to get quieter and quieter and quieter, right? And then sometimes that's when we see the symptoms becoming greater and greater and greater and greater. So how do we, as counselors, listen for this too and affirm this and work with that, Yeah, that little voice. Any other thoughts? Any other reactions? Yeah.
Relationship within the family. Like when he says he's just sitting in bed, tapping his feet, raising hands, and the pressure is building up. Like, is he talking to his parents about this? Is he not?
Yeah.
Pressure being released.
Right. That's such an astute point, too, because the literature does tell us that connection with family is really protective against this. So generally, the more isolated students are, the greater the likelihood they're going to be experiencing some of the adverse consequences of this culture. So that's a really good point. Yeah.
It almost seems a little bit parallel to the responsibilities of an adult.
Right.
To what extent,
Yes.
do these adolescents learn that or not learn just staying present and mindfulness, taking one thing at a time, and how as a society are we not conveying that message?
Right. I think that brings up such an important point too, that these are adolescents, and especially from where we come from a counseling perspective, from a developmental perspective, they have specific tasks of adolescents. They are not mini adults. We're not pushing them into, and that's often what we see, right? And we also see with students who are in this achievement orientation and in this culture sometimes, there are real problems with substance abuse. And that comes from this idea of, I have adult level pressures. I'm going to, deal with my pressures the same way as I see other adults doing that, which might be engaging in alcohol. So this is a really high risk population for alcoholism too, as they progress. So yeah, that's a really great point. And are we teaching if this is sort of how, some of the challenges these students are facing, are we giving them tools to deal with these adult level challenges, right? If it's mindfulness, if it's coping, yeah, all right. All right, so I've been talking about this term achievement pressure. I just want to take a minute to define what that looks like. So when we think about, this extreme achievement pressure, which, is basically this expectation to excel in multiple domains in life, and also experiencing developmentally inappropriate levels of stress in relation to this achievement. Finally, one of the most important things is this real hyper-focus on external achievements. So it's really who I am is what I can produce, who I am is what I can do. It's not more of an intrinsic, I am infinitely valuable and worthy and I have equal worth to everyone here in this room just by nature of me being here, right? So there is this, this real focus on external accomplishment. So we can see how students who sort of fit into this category are very vulnerable and fragile, because then what happens when they stop achieving, right? Or if there's a dip in achieving. This group is very high risk when they go to college, right? Especially if we think of those high achieving students in high school, top of the class, go to an Ivy League or an elite, institution, college or university, and then they're mid-pack, or maybe even worse, they're towards the bottom. Well, then who am I now, right? Who am I if I've always been the person who achieves, right? So, all right, so here's another voice. This is Caroline from Palo Alto, so another high achieving district. I can go into detail about the times I've had to go to urgent care because my stress and ensuing physical pain have been so concerning. I can tell you how I've missed periods because I've had so many tests to study for. I could express what it feels like to have a panic attack in the middle of a 30-person class and be forced to remain still. So she goes on too, and so she's talking about sort of like these somatic symptoms that she's experiencing. She goes on to talk about how she feels like a robot, Any reactions to this quote? Yeah, back.
I work in the prison junction area.
Yeah.
Mostly 8-year-olds to 18-year-olds, and I've heard this from so many of my clients, especially the ones in high school who are taking AP classes starting sophomore year, which I don't even think most people do, but it just seems so often that schools aren't equipped to handle a student who's having a panic attack.
Right.
Either just call an ambulance to take them out, or they say that they have to be out of school for a week, which causes even more anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like this never-ending cycle, and it really breaks my heart because
Yes.
schools are more focused on testing and
Right.
scores and all of that rather than the well-being of the students.
Right, I mean, we could consider this perhaps a psychiatric emergency, that she's sitting in this class and she's really suffering. And it's, she doesn't feel like she's able to move, she doesn't feel like she's able to ask for help, and I think you're speaking to this idea that it's sort of even normalized. This is gonna be part of your experience in school. You have to sort of like maybe take a little time off, then you have to come back. And when we're, some students, they graduate having taken 15 AP classes. Right, so 15 college level classes in high school, and in some places we really glorify that. We say, great, that's fantastic. Well, what are some of these unintended consequences, right? And how have we, again, quieted the voice of the student saying, this is wrong, this shouldn't be happening to me, right? Because a lot of times in some of these districts, that's no longer socially acceptable to give voice to that. See another hand? Yeah.
One of the things I noticed is that they're not learning how to fail.
Right.
They're not
Right.
learning how to recover from failure. And the smarter they are, the more they go on not failing. So at some point they're going to hit the wall where they realize they have to up their game as far as studying because they did barely. And then if they react to that failure,
Mm-hmm.
and their older grades start falling because they decide there must be something wrong with me.
Right. Right.
That's not being what you want.
Exactly. So when we fail, we learn to cope too, right? So that's how we build coping mechanisms, is by failing and learning how we pick ourselves back up. Also, if you don't want to fail, you don't take risks, right? How do we grow if we don't take risks, right? So, and then when we do fail, when we, anxious personality types sometimes then avoid, right? So then it's like, I can't bear the thought of failing again. I'm going to stop trying. I'm going to fail all my classes. And then I'm going to be in a hole. That's going to be really challenging to bring yourself, out of that place.
So I'm a school counselor, and years ago, I'm going to say about 7 years ago, our valedictorian went to Stanford.
Mm-hmm.
And this kid was brilliant.
Yeah.
Number one in the class, all AP classes. They graduate, like you said, well, Ivies and elite
Mhm.
schools don't take the AP credit, but they still
Mhm.
take the AP exams. But this kid, right after the first semester, he didn't do well. And he came home and he killed himself.
Yeah. Yeah.
They don't know how to deal with all the pressures.
Right. Right.
They are so used to, like you said, being number one, the
Mhm.
best at everything.
Mhm.
They don't
Mhm.
And he did that because he got a C and he freaked out. So the school sent it back.
Wow.
Like, you need
Right.
to get better.
Right.
Because he lost it.
Right. So that C was so devastating. That C was such a challenge to his identity, to who he thought he was,
And
who he.
ranks, and you see it across New Jersey now. More and more districts are getting away from that ranking.
Mhm.
Because of that.
Mhm.
The anxiety, the stress, the kids don't know how to cope. It's
Right.
That's all I see every
Right.
day.
Right.
Panic attacks,
Yeah.
anxiety attacks.
Yep.
And it's
Right. Right.
not ending.
We're seeing such an uptick of all of, I don't know if everyone saw the NJ.com article recently or they collected some data on suicide rates of adolescents in New Jersey continuing to tick up, right? So, and at least my experience with schools is sometimes, we put in more counselors, we don't necessarily look at maybe some of the conditions that are supporting the symptoms that we're seeing in our students. And also, one side will say, okay, we'll stop ranking, but we still need to make sure for our NJ monthly rankings that we have a 99% four-year college attendance rate, right? So because property values in New Jersey are really tied into those school rankings. So there's a lot on the line, right? And our kids are the ones that are, sort of on the front line of all of this. So, yeah.
I was just going to say that a lot of times when you say they don't know what failure is, part of that is failure is defined partially at least, maybe heavily, by society and culture.
Yeah.
Parents.
Yeah. Right.
So that it's, they could potentially cope if they defined it, but
That's a great point, right? And that's something fantastic to think about when we're working with that population, defining it.
Piggybacking off of what you said, I'm a counselor in a pre-K K1 building, so it's a
Yeah.
very different dynamic.
Yeah.
But the biggest argument that we have within personnel is teachers arguing versus everyone should win and get a turn versus teaching the kids discipline and boss down and stage in the classroom. So we go back and forth because the teachers who are teaching it are getting a little bit more of the friction between
Yeah.
the students, but
Right.
they're able to push them through it. Where the teachers who aren't teaching it, then when those students go into common areas like gym and lunch and recess, they're having more conflict because they don't know how to handle it. So it's like interesting to see at a younger level
Yes.
how they're handling it, because it also helps some parents teach it and some parents don't. So the kids who are used to it are able to handle it and be like, all right, I didn't win. The kids who aren't used to it are having more dramatic meltdowns, which then they're labeled as like the problem child.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. I think that's so important to think about how not only the high school level or the middle school level, but from our earliest stages of development, how we have to be thinking about that. Yeah, that's a good point.
I have two things. So piggyback on what you said, I have a 7-year-old, and now they're doing this social emotional thing in the school, which in concept is amazing, and they should absolutely do
Right.
it. You go to a little talk, and they give you the free book, and they do whatever. But when are they instituting it? Because they've got to sit do math, and they've got to do reading, and they have their little groups, and they barely get out of their chair all day.
Right.
The guidance counselors between 7 buildings will come in
Right.
and try to do conflict rights, and they'll try to do these things.
Right.
Again, the concept is great.
Right.
But again, parents aren't following
Yeah.
through. They have 2 minutes to do it in like a 6-hour day.
Exactly. Exactly. Right, right. It needs to be infused. Those messages can't be 2 minutes here and there, right? That needs to be infused throughout the curriculum. It has to be infused in how the teachers are talking to the students, the behavioral expectations in the room, and then what the schools are teaching the parents and what opportunities they give for the parents to sort of grow in their own understanding, right? Yeah. I mean, they're great, we've made great strides in terms of you have to read to your kids for 30 minutes a day, right? Like these types of things. How come we don't have a similar, right? And is the research like super strong with that? Like, yes, we have to read, but who knows, whatever. But can we do the same thing? They've been in school all day, right, yeah. There's lots of things that affect literacy. I mean, yes, like reading to your children are important, but is it the only thing, right? Yeah, all right. Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
The medical part of it, so when she went to the urgent care a hundred times, did any of the doctors say, hey, you're really stressed, let me teach you some self-care? And
Right.
things that you can be doing, like what's really going on with you looking at the whole
Yeah.
aspect of it.
Right. Yeah. Right. Right. And she goes on to become an advocate, and that's how her story comes out. So hopefully that was part of her story, you know, and that's, yeah, and she's advocating for. All right, so this student actually comes from my own research. So this is a student who lives in New Jersey. Brilliant, beautiful, generous, athletic. I mean, just like everything you would hope, you know, a leader. And when she told me the story, I mean, I still sort of get like shivers when I think about it. But she said, again here, as Dr. Ford said, she's calling BS on it. She's saying, I don't think it should be like this. But all of junior year, all I wanted to do was like get the score on my ACTs. It's like, that's all I did junior year, was like study, take practice ACTs, and then do it. Working hard for the ACT score and finally getting what I got was one of the best days of my life. We were skiing, and I pulled out my phone on the ski lift, and my friend's like, do you get your ACT score yet? And I'm like, no. So I go and check it online, and we're going around, and I'm like, oh my gosh, look. And this is a student who comes from a very affluent district, a very affluent family. She has lots of privilege, right? So the fact that, you know, I mean, this is how all of that is being funneled. So we think about the other things she could possibly be doing with her time, or growing, or preparing to be a citizen who's going to help change all of the challenges that we need someone, right, to change in the world. And yet she's saying, and of course she's an adolescent, so some of this might be a little bit of just her being dramatic too. I think the truth is here, you know, is that was her primary focus in junior year. And when she said it was one of the best days of her life.
She's skiing, she's not even enjoying the moment.
That's what I'm saying. I mean, girl, get
Right.
go back to skiing.
Right. With your friend, which is what adolescents should be doing, right? Yeah. Right. Right. And my sample for this study was taken randomly. So it wasn't like I was referred this student or told that this student, wow, she has a story, you need to listen to her. No, this was random. And I heard stories like this in the voices of my students throughout the research that I've done, you know, similar stories. This one is particularly dramatic, I think. So again, we're thinking about what she's not doing when she's doing this, right? So where are developmentally what's not happening, and then also where could her energies be better spent too? I mean, the ACTs and the SATs, it's really just, studying for that is just helping you take the test. It's not like you're really learning something that you can build on, you know, and do something with moving forward, right? So any other reactions to this quote? Mm-hmm. Right. The worst days, maybe, right? What's the corollary to that? Yeah. Any other thoughts before we move on? No.
Just with a friend, so there could be peer pressure as well. So they
Right.
sharing this terrible experience.
Yeah.
Reinforcing it.
Right, absolutely. And we certainly can see that in certain communities, right, of that sort of reinforcing, yeah. And then I won't read this one, but this was basically like, again, these messages that students might be, children, adolescents might be receiving from their community is saying, you know, we think that we are giving children and adolescents all the opportunities in the world, right? Especially if there's some level of privilege there. But really, when we look at it, is there a pretty prescribed path in terms of who, you know, our ideal student is? So she really wanted to be an artist. She wanted to be an artist her whole life. She was a talented artist, but she got continuous messages about, you're gonna make no money doing that, you can't do that, right? So she gave up her hopes and dreams of being an artist and instead went to a military academy, you know, to become an engineer. I mean, so that was quite a stark change, right? And then not to say, you know, how are we helping adolescents also see the, you know, to illuminate other paths for them. So we need more creative thinkers in the world. We need, all right, so maybe you won't be a visual artist, but let's think a little bit more about what creativity could look like in your life moving forward and in your career paths. All right, so some of the costs of this extreme achievement orientation. So obviously chronic stress, and we know all of the negative outcomes of chronic stress, especially when it comes to mental health conditions, lack of wellness, and then foregoing the other important tasks of adolescence, and reduced opportunities to develop coping skills. So we talked about a lot of these so far. All right, but here's some other things that we might not consider as readily. So when our self-worth is tied to achievements, then if I don't achieve, I'll feel worthless, right? And then if I do achieve, I live in a constant state, right, of continuing to achieve, because I continue to have to prove myself then, right? So great, I got an A on that last test, well, there's another test on Friday, so I have to keep on going, right? So just thinking about it now, you can feel that sort of like wheel that these students are on. And then also, you know, my identity
And how I got
achievement. So if I don't achieve, who will I be? This is a really interesting study that was conducted by Weiss Board in 2011. So these are adolescents' perceptions of their parents' values. So in this study, the majority of participants indicated that for their parents, getting into a good college was more important than being a good person. Yeah, it's pretty shocking, right? But we have to think about the messages that we are sending our youth. So, and working in high schools in New Jersey, I can see how students might think, because that's what we're really promoting in a lot of ways, is college, 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 right? That's sort of the golden road to happiness and success and a good life moving forward. So part of when we talk about interventions and, you know, what's the path forward, how do we bring this forward? How do we really prioritize a moral development? How do we prioritize, you know, service to others? What can that look like in our communities and with the students that we work with and the children, adolescents that we work with? And then higher ed. So if we're working with these students in the, you know, the high school level, the middle school level, what's going to happen when they go off to, you know, possibly away to colleges and universities? We have a mental health epidemic on college and university campuses across the country, and it is tied in some part to this. So one thing, I think we've talked about most of this, but one thing is this concept of pen face. So this idea, it was coined, has anyone here read What Made Maddie Run? Yeah, do you want to just say a little bit about that, or? Yeah, not to put you on the spot, but yeah.
So Maddie was a pretty high-achieving, popular athletic student in high school in New Jersey, and then she had this opportunity. She really loved playing soccer, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And then she got into running, and UPenn was recruiting her for running because she really wanted to go to Leeds.
Right. Yeah. Yep.
For
Mm-hmm.
soccer. Ended up going to UPenn because it was UPenn, and she just really wasn't happy there. She was really struggling mental health-wise. She gave little clues throughout it, but you know, nobody really fully understood the extent, and she ended up jumping off one of the buildings freshman year to killing herself.
Yeah. So the question is, what made Maddie run? What made Maddie run and make this inauthentic choice, because she loved soccer, she didn't really like to run, so what made her do that? And then also she ran off the parking deck. So what made Maddie run? Yeah.
Happening here, sorry, this is like kind of related,
Yeah.
but the director, I think, of mental health services at UPenn actually killed himself by suicide the same way.
I did not know that. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. So we, yeah, yeah.
It's like Penn culture and how there's
Right.
students who are feeling this way. I forget the term that they called it, but it was like something about all the kids he knew. Like not a
Wow.
lot of kids were really happy there. It's a very high achieving school, the pressures that were put on them, and there wasn't anything done about it.
Wow. So we think also about these concentric circles too, of how this, and how we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg too, when we're seeing these suicides. that what other suffering is laying beneath the surface and sort of, impaired functioning. And yeah, thank you for sharing that. And thank you for sharing that other important detail too. So this idea of pen face is this idea that on the outside, I am an Ivy League, student, right? I have it all together, but then inside it's swirling, right? That everything is swirling, like I am an absolute mess, but I can never let that show because that's not what it means to be a pen, right? So what does it mean when so when we have high achievers, what are those messages that they're receiving too about who they have to be, and can they even ask for help? Can they even share some of the things? Because is that then a threat to who we expect them to be or who they expect themselves to be? Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah. All right, so here is, so it's a great book, What Made Maddie Run. Kate Fagan from ESPN was a journalist who wrote a book on it. I highly recommend that you read it. It just really gives sort of finger on the pulse sort of to what's going on with this community right now. But here's a counselor, and this is actually a quote from a counselor that she interviewed for her book. And she says, and I don't know how many of us can relate to this, but I know I certainly can. My clients have spent their adolescences putting their healthy development on hold, coached and managed by parents who are so fearful and anxious about helping their children succeed that there's simply no room for their children to begin to know themselves. When they arrive at college, the wheels come off. They are so hard on themselves, and they're out of touch with what they really care about. Discovering their true interest is a foreign concept. There is such a push for perfection that normal life skills are not in place. Substance abuse and other methods of self-medicating are rampant. Yeah. Does this resonate with anyone who works with this population, or, yeah? Yeah.
I work at a mental health agency, and I had done an evaluation for, it was a high school student, and he had suicidal ideation, passive thoughts, like, I don't want to be here, was self-harming, and then met with him individually first. He was explaining, like, the pressures that he had. It is a very good school district as well. And, so I talked to him about doing the day program and really focusing on, benefiting himself, being in our DBT program because of self-harming, and
Yeah,
his
yeah.
mom wasn't aware. Pulled the mom in, I talked to her, as well. After that, I put them together to say, like, the recommendation for the day program. And he was all on board, like, right before mom had come in, and mom's like, really want to be out of school, like, to do this program. I said, like, he wouldn't be impacted, he could do the schoolwork here, all of that. And the mom was like, yeah, but you really don't want to miss school, right? And she just kept, like,
Wow.
saying, he's like, actually,
Yeah.
I'm really, like, anxious
Yeah.
about missing school, and I don't want to miss my schoolwork.
Wow.
But you really need this program.
Right.
That's what mental health.
Right,
It was just
right.
kind of a battle.
Yeah.
Eventually, he did do the program, did really well. Ended up, like, getting medication for the depression and anxiety, and,
Wow.
ended up doing the after-school program even, and said, like, this, like, changed how he thought about this, really helped him, but it could have all not worked out. His mom was not even allowed to
Right.
to outpatient therapy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because she was so afraid.
Right.
Didn't even know about the self-harm. I said, you need to, like,
Mhm.
really work on it. He has suicidal ideation with self-harm. You have to.
Well, good for you, and good for you to continue to push and advocate for your client to get the help that he needed, right? I mean, that's such a good example and story, right? And I think that parents, so this is sort of cultural messages that students are receiving. And we also have to think about messages that students are receiving from the parents and teachers too, right? Because oftentimes when we get at students, the messages have been so internalized. So what is the fear that that mom is feeling? Where is that coming from, right? Where is this? Why do our students need to succeed or achieve at such levels?
She also didn't want to accept, I think, the fact that he was struggling with those things and
Yeah.
in that category of other kids who are in this program.
Right,
So she
right.
was so resistant to the
Yeah.
fact that he was struggling so much. that
Right.
She was kind of like, well, I don't want you to be here because of your kid.
Yes. So garden variety mental health stigma, right? That we all have to deal with. Yeah.
He was kind of on board with it until he had to reflect and think, oh, well, maybe I shouldn't. Because
Yeah,
I'm not
yeah,
like that.
yeah,
Like, I'm
right.
not.
And I don't belong here with these people. Right, right. Do you have something? Yeah.
Yes, I would say to be
Right, right. Yes, yeah, right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Social media, absolutely. Right? We're seeing like carefully curated images, highly edited, images. Adolescents too, depending on where they are cognitively with their own development, can often be very black and white thinkers, not seeing the nuance. But what are we doing across the spectrum to try and help students develop these critical capacities to question and think a little bit more critically?
Could it also be too just the idea that we are moving out of like an industrialized
Absolutely.
society and moving into like this digital age now where, back, 60s, 70s, like getting a job in a factory, you can make a relatively
Exactly.
wage and have
Exactly.
healthcare and raise a family. But now, like these industries are going by the wayside and it's like that competitive drive. It's almost
Yep.
like our human instincts kick in. There's not enough food to go around the table, so it's like you have to almost overachieve.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head on some of these fears that are very real in 21st century globalization. Even jobs that we could count on a generation ago in terms of, those sort of like those great, doctor or lawyer. I mean, those are sort of going, we're losing some of those, or engineering, or, just with our, rapidly changing economy, there is a lot of fear. There is a lot of fear. From a parent's perspective too, So we have to really keep that in mind when we're working with the whole family too, of some of these, what's going on culturally that can be driving some of this. Yeah. Okay. So if we look at students who are in the achievement orientation and we sort of break it down by both young women and young men, we can see some, alarming rates. So anxiety and depression rates are 2 times national norms, high body dissatisfaction, and then also just some of the things that we see with girls, some of the other expectations in terms of, having to be super, achievers, but then also be, beautiful and effortless perfection and, the right level of alluring, but not too sexual. There's a lot. So we think of all of that these girls are carrying around, all of these pressures, and just thinking about sort of this pressure cooker that these students might feel like they're in, and might not have the skills to deal with that. And then for young men too, we're seeing high rates of anxiety and depression, and comparable rates of delinquency as boys from very low SES urban communities. All right, so what do we think about that statistic? Right. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Essentially pushing off the middle.
Yeah.
You know,
Right. Yeah.
So that idea of like you're either an overachiever or underachiever, it's like the spectrum. Where's the
Right. Yeah. So if we look at these delinquency rates too, so we see this especially with students that aren't expecting consequences from their parents, right? So something that, thinking about how parents prioritize their children's well-being by putting consequences as a way to show that they sort of value, right, their children and their well-being. So we can talk a little bit more about that when we talk about interventions. So we're also seeing narcissistic traits. Boys from an achievement-oriented, affluent population might have preoccupation with activities that betray power and status. And then boys with narcissistic tendencies might have a hard time forging connections, right? So if we're also thinking about students who are high achievers, who might be from affluent communities, going on and, running corporations or, having powerful positions in our society, I think there is some mirroring here of some of the things that we're seeing with men in positions of power, right, in our country. So thinking about how these traits could be developing from even earlier ages than we think. So again, we have to look at how we can start to level some of this, all right? We talked about this a little bit too, but really high rates of substance use. And then just as an aside, this culture, so this high achieving culture, how can this impact a greater inequity that we see in our culture, right? So if we are really prioritizing, so we're sort of driving these kids, and we're meaning culturally, collectively, driving these kids to these achievement places so they can get into an Ivy League school, so they can live, this like really beautiful life, so we say. But what does that mean then for sort of the other side of the coin, right? So in terms of kids who haven't had the same access to capital, to social capital, to economic capital, to cultural capital. So we like to tell kids, right? We like to sell the story of meritocracy, that if you just work hard, right, you can get the American dream. So kids on both sides of the socioeconomic scale internalize that. So kids, that myth, right? It's a myth. So kids from affluent communities, kids from these achievement-oriented places internalize, well, I got here, so I must be something really special, right? They internalize that. Where it's like, yes, you worked really hard, but you also had a lifetime of privilege, right? And that privilege, economic, social, cultural, all of those things, the way you dress, the way you speak, what you read, where you go on vacation, who your parents' friends are, right? Having the $300,000 at your disposal to go to a private school. That's all, you didn't do that, right? Someone else did. But same thing on the other side. So we know from the research too that kids from low socioeconomic statuses also will internalize. Well, I didn't get there, there must be something flawed with me. And the same thing, well, the system did exactly what it was supposed to do. It kept you down, right? Because of your position in society, So we have to be thinking really critically not only what this achievement orientation is doing for individual lives, especially in terms of these adverse mental health consequences, but also what it means in a larger cultural picture too, right? So is there also a larger cultural reason that we need to be sort of examining this and examining the way we're working with students, especially for those of us who work in schools or work with schools or are parents or are members of communities? Any thoughts or reactions to this point, Dr. Ford?
I was wondering from the other side of the coin.
Yeah,
what about
right.
for students that are in low SES but are high achieving?
Right. Yeah.
And have this extreme achievement orientation.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you've seen anything regarding that and the pressure that their families are putting on them to succeed, because they may be the one to get out.
Right.
They may be that first generation
Right.
college student, so they're getting all this pressure from their family to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
What have you found with regard to how they handle their extreme achievement orientation?
Mm-hmm.
Because, they're the ones that are shooting for the Ivy League.
Right.
And the Ivy League is also trying to snatch up, black and brown kids, especially that come from low SES.
Right.
And
right.
so they may have that chance too.
Yeah.
But they may not have access to someone that's going to help them with their mental health well-being.
Right.
Because of that high achievement
Right.
and the pressure they're getting from their family. Not only their blood kin, but their fictive kin. That's pressuring them to succeed.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's an understudied population too, So students who are coming, these high achievers coming from low SES. So when we're thinking about the additional levels of pressure and stress that these students have, because they are the first, they have the hopes and dreams of their family, and then also perhaps a larger, cultural group that's attached to them. Absolutely. I would also think that they probably, because again, I'm not familiar with the research for that community. There isn't any, right? Yeah. But I would think that there probably would be more protective factors. And that might be, you know, maybe not in terms of connection, than we might be seeing with some of these other students. That's just, what are your thoughts?
I'm going to disagree with you.
Really? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm going to disagree with you because those protective factors are still latent in white privilege. And especially this whole concept of grit. Grit is very marginalizing for young black and brown kids. And so I would think that they would feel this a lot worse because they don't have those protective factors.
Right, right. Well, they certainly don't have the protective factors that come along with privilege, right? With all of the socioeconomic, racial, you know, all of that.
They're first generation, and so their parents may not know what to do to deal with this. All they know is that I don't care what you're going through, you got to suck that up and deal with it.
Right.
And that's damaging within itself.
Right.
And add up to that, most first-gen students are black. And so they may not have those mechanisms in place to do that.
Right, absolutely. You're right. And then if they do get to a university, if they do even say that they're struggling or need help, is anyone in that system equipped to deal with the needs of that student, right? No, no. Thank you for, absolutely. It's your research topic, And what's also interesting, something that the research does point to is that going back to this idea of meritocracy, is that, so again, we're teaching black and brown students and white students that you just work hard and you'll get there. But there's been some great data that's been collected recently that shows us at Ivy League institutions, the number of kids that come from poor black and brown communities and end up as, a graduate, a rich adult, are so tiny, right? So a lot of the kids that are being offered admission are kids that are coming from high SES backgrounds to begin with, too. That is really a very small piece of that pie, and you can go on. The New York Times actually has this great interactive graphic that will show you Dartmouth. How many of those kids are a poor kid and will end up becoming a rich adult? It's like 1.5% of the kids who are sitting in freshman class rooms at Dartmouth. It might not be Dartmouth, it might be, but it's, it's not much better at Dartmouth if it's not 1.5%. So again, right, so, and not to say that we are going to be the ones to necessarily change all of this, but we need to have a critical awareness of the reality. And also for our students' sake, our kids' sake, our clients' sake, we need to also be able to sort of critically discuss and examine some of these issues. All right, so if we're thinking about just how this is perpetuating inequity too, so the kids who have privilege aren't examining, how their privilege has played into where they are, right? And that's also important because if we recognize, okay, so I'm here, I have privilege, then there's a greater responsibility perhaps in terms of what do I have to do with that privilege. So that's part of the problem in terms of what we might be seeing with our students when we're seeing these mental health issues emerging. So the students that I worked with, had this real, in terms of my own research, some were struggling in terms of their own mental health, They had a desire to give back, but through their white cultural values oftentimes, it was a very individualistic view in terms of how I should be using my energy. I need to be using, that sort of a white cultural value is really rugged individualism, a very individualistic, I'm gonna look out for me, I'm gonna work hard for me. However, if they would have shifted a little bit perhaps, and they said, okay, I have this great responsibility due to this privilege I have, that could have really helped them in terms of where they were with their own mental health, right? Because we know that altruism, we know that connection, we know that giving back, we know that all of that is tied to more positive mental health outcomes. So we have to think about that, but we also have to think about the status quo and just how when we're not openly disputing the status quo, we're maintaining the status quo. All right. So this came out of my research. So one of my students that I was working with said, we all kind of realize that those who've worked harder had the opportunity to apply to a better school, and we've earned that chance. And I guess the students who haven't didn't work as hard. So this is how we're perpetuating privilege. We're perpetuating racism. We're perpetuating, right, through this narrative. Any thoughts, any reactions? And I mean, this is a best and brightest student too. Yeah, right. Right. Yeah. Right. Right, go ahead, keep going, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
I think, like the perpetuation of these values and stuff need to be tended to or looked at through the eyes of just like generational differences and all the factors that, go along with each cohort. I see
Right, yeah.
Parents and their teenagers they're speaking two different. If you look at the traits acquired by parents and traits acquired by adolescents, whether it's through gaming or whatever, like there's these wars. And it's like, how do you bridge the barrier to realize that even though there's differences, there's also similarities. And just all the other factors.
Yeah.
Social conditions, economic environments that, parents just don't realize that things have really changed since when they, what would have you, you know what I mean? Just taking all these factors into consideration that, for young people, it really is different. And where these expectations come from, I just see a lot like
Right.
parents will a lot.
Yes. Right, right. Absolutely. Yeah. All right. All right, so some of this is we need to also be advocates, so to be advocates in changing systems for our individual clients and students' well-being, but also for more socially just kind of space, right? And let's talk a little bit about interventions. So Sonia Luther is probably one of the preeminent researcher and scholar in this area of the extreme research orientation. She spent most of her career at Columbia University. She's at ASU now. But she talked about how when we were learning about some of the adverse consequences of kids living in poverty, mothers in those communities would fiercely protect their children, in terms of some of the ills of living in perhaps a violent community or community, some of the things that could happen in terms of living in poverty, some of the conditions. We also need parents and people who support children and support adolescents to have a similar view, since this is the fourth leading risk factor for adolescent well-being. We need people who work with children and adolescents to have a similar kind of protective stance, to be protecting our children and adolescents from the same kinds of toxic. These are sort of toxic messages. It's not so much of a dangerous external world, but it is sort of a dangerous in terms of internally how these messages are communicated to children. So how do we protect children and how do we dispute some of these messages? So clear and consistent messages from adults in children's and adolescents' lives is crucially important too. So what do you think some of those messages could sound like?
Only good if you do well.
Right, right. So what's the opposite? What should parents and people who are in the lives of children and adolescents, what should they be saying instead?
Do your best.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to love you regardless.
Exactly, right? Yeah, right. I do your best. I'm going to love you regardless. Yeah. Other thoughts?
Let's focus on what your strengths are.
Yeah, right, right. Be a kid. So who's saying that? Yeah, yes, right? So creating space for play is really important for people across the lifespan. Yes, absolutely. All right, so one of the things too that the research points to is unconditional positive regard. So really, this fervent, deep belief in the intrinsic worth of a person and acceptance of a person, no matter how that person performs, right? Because we're seeing a real sort of performance of childhood, performance of adolescence. Well, I'm going to accept you. So this, though, takes a lot of resources in terms of a parent, right? I mean, to be able to display this unconditional positive regard. You know, that I can be really displeased in your behavior, but I still love you fiercely. And I'm gonna send you that message over and over and over again. As a parent myself, this is hard work, and I miss the mark a lot on this. So we think about parents in our 21st century globalized economy who are working hard and stretched thin and have their own issues, their own mental health issues, their own substance abuse issues, their own, right, under-resourced parents. So how do we, if we're working with students and clients, how do we help parents also get the resources they need so they can meet their children in this place, you know, this place of unconditional positive regard. Yeah, so, you know, this idea too of, you know, really being able to take the perspective of the adolescent is a really important piece of unconditional positive regard too. So really understand and take that time in context to understand what it means for that student not to, you know, to get a poor grade on the test, right? What does that mean? All right, so interventions for the parents. So as I mentioned, assessing the resourcing of parents is really important. Also, emotional closeness with parents, especially mothers, is protective. So someone said that before, I think maybe back here, and we talked a little bit about that, about really how do we help, you know, how do we help bolster that? How do we help both, you know, all parties find that space? Assess technology usage, because we know social media and sort of the ills that or just spending too much time and what that does to an adolescent brain. And how do we ease performance pressure? That's something that's much easier said than done in a lot of communities, but we can be thinking about what that can look like, right? And I think that probably does start on that K-2 level, right? So, you know, when a kid comes home at the end of the day, you're not asking about how they did on the test or how Johnny did on the test or how anyone did on the test, right? You're asking about what did you do that was kind today? How did you help someone else? So we're prioritizing moral and ethical behavior, moral, ethical, altruistic behavior. Right, so valuing moral behavior and service to others over individual achievement. So that's one of sort of the key takeaways. Allowing adolescents space to develop on their own and make mistakes, discipline, setting limits, and building responsibility. Any thoughts about these interventions for parents? Yeah.
So, I understand the need to create a sense of community, a sense of stepping outside of yourself. But when you say don't address achievement, don't address how did you do on the test.
Mm-hmm.
Where's the balance? Because at some point, our children need standards.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
100%. Right.
Expectations need to not only incorporate doing well in school,
Yeah.
as well as doing well in the community.
100%.
Everybody doesn't get a trophy just because you can.
Right, right, right.
At some point, there has to be accountability. On the part of
Yes.
parents, on the part of the children.
Yeah.
We've become a society of blaming everybody else for what's
Yeah, so you bring up a really good point. So this idea too of high expectations of parents are tied to positive outcomes in kids. So you're right that there is a balance, you know? So I think my example just now was on the K-2 level, you know? Maybe at that point we're not at all looking at achievement for my K-2 your second grader, that I'm looking at moral behavior. But you're right, for my middle schooler or high schoolers, absolutely, we're gonna be having those high expectations. But how do we tie that to giving them, having high expectations for performance and doing your best, but also in a place where I'm gonna love you fiercely and value you, even if you don't meet those expectations.
You have to give them, you have to help them learn how to look in the mirror and be honest with themselves, personal accountability.
Yeah, right.
I had 2 children. If you brought me a D and you worked hard for that,
Yeah,
that D was okay.
yeah,
But
right.
if I knew you could get an A and you brought me a D, that was a different
Mm-hmm,
conversation.
mm-hmm,
But I set targets.
Mhm.
You want to do extracurricular activity because my children were capable.
Mhm.
Anything less
Mhm.
than a B, you weren't doing. It was
Right.
just stop. But you also had chores that you had to do.
mm-hmm.
They were involved in community service activities. They worked at, helped out at the church. It's about parents being involved. And
Mhm.
I think some parents are so busy on the social scale trying to impress others
Mhm.
that they're not taking the time
Yeah.
to really invest in their children.
Right.
And I think that's,
Mm-hmm.
at least that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I really appreciate how you're highlighting this balanced approach too, that it wasn't just about this academic achievement, it was also help around the house and community service. There was expectations all around. And also this linking it to the internal growth, right? I want you to do the best you can do, but what I'm hearing you say too is, you're developing, you're getting better, you're getting, right, instead of, I want you to get an A, so you can get into, and to get into Harvard or whatever, right? That it really is we're valuing intellectual curiosity, we're valuing growth, we're valuing working hard, we're valuing persevering. So,
Having conversations.
yeah, right. Mm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Was there another hand over here, or?
Just wanted to comment on 2 things that you said. One was about the trophies, everyone getting a trophy. So I have a little story. My girlfriend, daughter, 4 years old, was playing soccer, but mostly picking up the little flowers. So when the trophy came at the end of the season, everyone got a trophy, and my girlfriend took the trophy and gave it back. She said she did not participate. When all the kids were playing, she was picking flowers, and she does not deserve this trophy. And she was 4 years old, so she's seeing everyone with a trophy, and then she's like, I want a trophy. You did not earn a trophy. And he's teaching the kids early on that you have to earn things. Not just because you play the sport. Not everybody is great and deserves a trophy.
And it's not the end of the world, right? Okay, you didn't get a trophy, right? Let's move on, right? Right, yeah, yeah.
And I think that's,
Right.
that's an issue. And the other
Yeah.
comment on the second thing you said about, parenting and setting limits and discipline. As a school counselor, I call parents a lot, and then it's a shame because I think to myself, oh, no wonder why the child is acting like this, right? And it's just a shame. They expect us as a school or as a private, clinician to do the work for them. It's just, they don't want to take responsibility for being a parent.
And some of that, what I think we're seeing too with these parents, I'm probably one of them. I mean, I don't want to demonize any group, but is when parents are under-resourced, when they're working all the time, when, and they see their 4-year-old crying. It's hard for them, and they probably might not have a great set of social network. They're probably estranged from their own family, right? They see their little 4-year-old, who probably takes up way too much space in their lives than they have historically, crying. They might be like, here you go, right? Because the attachment isn't appropriate to, necessarily, that parent's looking to get too many of their own emotional needs met by that child, right? So then that's when we see parents like, well, I need you to be close to me, so I'm gonna give you whatever you want, I don't want you to cry, So we have to look at that in context also, right? So why is it hard for parents maybe to make some of these decisions? When we think about resourcing, what else do parents need to perhaps do a better job when it comes to some of these things with their kids?
A lot of them need mental health.
Yes, yeah, right,
They do.
right. And but there's not a judgment there, and there's not a, right, yeah.
And their children, and they are getting their kids help, but they're not getting help for themselves.
Right. And are we comfortable having those conversations with parents of the children and clients that we work with. Yeah.
I think it's critical to have parents be very specific. Because adolescents will take those general things and still interpret it as they want me to do this, they want me to do that, without getting them to say, okay, well, we will accept you as long as you're doing that. Well, what does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
What exactly does that mean? Otherwise, many will interpret that as, I have to get A's.
Yeah.
Get,
Right.
100.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Without having them specific, I think.
Right. Right. So another hand over here. Yeah.
I'm sort of torn about the 4-year-old.
About the 4-year-old. Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah.
I sort of feel like the lesson isn't to the 4-year-old, the lesson is to the community or the coach. That they sort of create this thing where everybody gets it, and it puts a lot of pressure on the parent.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
like teach a lesson, but then that kid is going to be potentially subject to the coach, the rest of the kids, and because it's the community that's doing it. Like,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
if the feeling is that giving a trophy to everybody, then I think the parents should set some boundaries for the coaches. And
Right.
the program.
Yeah. Yeah.
Of saying like,
Right.
well, on the other hand, 4-year-olds will always think flowers. So
Yeah. Right. Right.
and
Yeah.
so it's I think I'd be careful, or at least like I said, I was torn. I don't know.
Yeah. Right.
Not just because our 4-year-old did that.
Yeah. Right. Personal experience. Yeah. Yeah. I think is there a hand in the back? Yeah.
I have a question, or not a reflection so much, but I'm wondering if and how you have the topic of conversation regarding privilege with adolescents or perhaps their families, because I think it's great to have that conversation, and we're in an environment right now that's supportive of that, and we can all, support that idea in a general sense.
Mm-hmm.
But I find that that is a topic, like as a college professor myself, as a clinician myself, is one of the topics I get met with the utmost adversity.
Mm-hmm.
And not just by like the white, heterosexual,
Mhm.
privileged person, but even from minority students,
Mhm.
even from minority clients, where it's like we deny this idea of privilege, but I think it's a really important point to talk about. It's like, well, if you're standing right in front of a basketball hoop, you're going to slam dunk it further than the person standing in the back of the court.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just wondering how you introduce that, or if you do at all.
Yeah.
Something you try to
Right. Right. I don't think it's a one point in time conversation. I mean, I think it's something that we have to be looking at everything. So not only the conversations we're having, the systems that are in place, within a school, who is teaching, who are in positions of leadership, who's on the PTA, what does our curriculum look like, who are we teaching about, how are we teaching, what do we value, So I think part of it too, within the context of a school, that's sort of my background, is forming alliances with sort of like-minded people, right? And then trying to find inroads in terms of, how can we look at the curriculum? I'm curious about this. I wonder, why aren't we talking, why are our students reading all old white dead men? Can we possibly introduce, because when we start introducing other stories, we're introducing other lived experiences where maybe we can start having some of these conversations. Because I agree with you. I mean, there is a lot of pushback. There is a lot of, because it is antithetical in a lot of ways to what we teach about the American dream and the American mythology, and that's hard to let go of for a lot of people. However, I think those conversations are happening in really fruitful ways in lots of different spaces. I don't know if that helps at all in terms of, yeah.
No, it's like a deeper rooted, ongoing
Right.
effort rather than one directed conversation.
Yeah, and there's lots that, youth leading activism, participatory youth action research. I mean, there's a lot that's going on. Even, within institutions, having it a standing agenda item in terms of looking at privilege, looking at race, looking at social justice. what opportunities can we provide people within institutions to do further work and further exploration? What can some of that look like? I know there is, my department went to the White Privilege Conference this past year, which was a phenomenal exercise, but there were a lot of school districts that sent groups of parents, teachers, also to this conference to be able to engage in some of those critical conversations. So, yeah, I don't know if that helps. Yeah. Was there another? Yeah.
Yeah, just kind of piggyback off of what
Yeah.
Diana was saying. I'm a little bit torn as well in terms of like parents and interventions because on the other side of the spectrum, like I spoke about, the parent that was like not all for treatment because they were afraid, and that fear is like
Yeah.
very real to them. And
Right.
the other side of it is some of these parents that are coming in, like I don't set these expectations. I don't know where this is coming from.
Right.
This kid has their own
Yeah.
like impression or
Mhm.
this, community of, achievement orientation of
Yeah.
putting these pressures on themselves.
Right.
The parents are like,
Right.
to excel like this. It's
Yeah.
and then, exposure right now to all of these different things is very different from what I think we were exposed to
Mhm.
in our adolescence. Like I wasn't exposed to as much of what these other kids are exposed to in the social media and with, everything that's going on with the suicide rate and with, school shootings and like,
Sure.
just so
Right.
much
Right.
exposure
Yeah.
to things. Even substance use is an epidemic in
Right.
schools. So it's a lot of things that the parents are, they can be a great parent.
100%.
But
Absolutely.
they
Yeah.
can't this
Right.
exposure. So
right.
I think, yes, it
Yeah.
does stem from the home
Mhm.
environment and parents working with their kids, but then there's a whole other level to it with, it's a scary thought, but regardless of what they're doing at
Mhm.
home, they're exposed in their communities and their schools
Mhm.
to all these different things. and
Absolutely.
pressures
Right.
that they really can't.
Right. Right. The community, the community of school, the friend group, all of that, and also some of these messages that students internalize, as there was a comment in the back before, are sort of can be subtle. Do your best. Well, how does that student internalize that, right? What are some of the messages that we're sending from early ages? So, absolutely, it might be very blatant in terms of, but there might also be little things that parents can take a look at. How can I be really bolstering some of these other messages? Or in terms of, moral development or what have you. And how can I be advocating at my student's school too for culture change? What does that look like? Instead of, as much as I want more counselors in schools, believe me, job security, I don't think that's really how we solve this problem. I think that's part of it, but I think that there are some other things that we need to be looking at. So just some other ideas for interventions. Interventions for adolescents who are in these places. So, your value does not depend on your academic achievement. Defining success on your own terms, exploring your life goals, engaging in all of the tasks of adolescence. Cognitive, social, emotional. Social is such a big part of an adolescent's experience. And we see a lot of adolescents living in isolation. So living in isolation due to social media, living in isolation just that we're fraying in terms of our social fabric. But that's such a crucial, sort of cornerstone of adolescence. So additional interventions to think about is, values, building connection. I know we're running out of time, so I'm just running through these quickly. Altruism, increasing ability to handle stress, CBT strategies, and also this idea. Oh, okay, all right, yeah. And then also this idea of examining meaning and purpose in life too. So when we go back to the example of Leah before, who was on the ski lift, who, was like, this was one of the happiest days of my life, studying for and taking the ACTs. We find things like, so meaning and purpose, having meaning and purpose is really protective when it comes to adolescent mental health. There's a really strong body of literature that supports that. So, but the things that we need for something to be meaningful is that students are engaged in it over time, that it's freely chosen, and that it's something that they feel that is important to them. right? So we have to think about how do we help students find those conditions in their own lives? Are we giving them freedom to select those things, to stick with those things? And generally, if it's not, at least in my experience, if it's not valued by the college admissions process, oftentimes kids are like, that's it, right? They're not going to engage with those types of activities, even if it would help establish meaning and purpose in their own lives. So some ideas for school counselors too, looking at this culture of individualism and disconnection and creating opportunities for students to play, explore, take risks, connect, challenging the meritocracy, and advocating for humane and developmentally appropriate expectations of youth. So there is a movement in the college admissions process, which is sort of spearheaded by Weisenborg, who I cited before. So it's an initiative through Harvard called Turning the Tide. And it's looking to sort of change the way that we evaluate students from the college admissions perspective. And really, because right now we are privileging certain populations using based on the criteria that we use. So a student that has to go home after school every day and take care of an elderly relative, and is not participating in, 3 sports, isn't getting the same, doesn't have as strong of an application. But we know that that student is engaging in really meaningful work, right? So it's this push for the community to sort of reevaluate how we're looking at students, right? And yeah. Wow.
And she read me this essay after she had gotten it, she's superstitious and everything. And it was beautiful.
Wow.
And they accepted her, and she was asking them, why me? They were like, this essay.
Wow. 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 All right. Well, that's fantastic to hear too, because I've heard also mixed reviews whether these schools are taking up. Like everyone signed on to the Turning the Tide project. You can find it online. It's great. But are schools actually, walking the walk of that? So it's fantastic to hear an example, of where that might be happening. Yeah. So we are not looking for kids, right, to highest GPAs, highest SATs, varsity sports, captains of sports, right? We're looking for achievement and intellectual curiosity in a much different way, right? So I encourage you to take a look at that and also share that with students in your lives, clients in your lives that might be, in these kinds of places. So, so let's see. All right, so what else can we be doing to help change the tide? So ongoing discussions about the extreme achievement orientation, illuminating multiple life paths, and career paths to youth at all stage of development. Engaging with our students and clients about a larger discussion about what they want their lives to look like, right? So in some ways, we really treat young people like little adults, in terms of some of the expectations that we put on them. But in other ways, we don't, in terms of really reflecting on their full humanity and talking about hopes and dreams and fears for their lives. So giving them space to do that, to really dream and explore and try things out and be there by their side, encouraging them in that process. And then also engaging in an ongoing discussion about how educational practices can either oppress or liberate youth, right? And advocating for practices that seek to liberate. Because a lot of what we see in what some of these practices that are happening is very oppressive for these students, sort of oppressive conditions. That students are not being taught how to be fully free in the world, right? They have some real constraints around them. So we'll just end with this quote. In these days of assumed meritocracy where children can be turned into anything, we admire them as displays of remarkable engineering to be tweaked and fine-tuned into bilingual perfection. What we've lost, perhaps, is a sense that there may be things about them that we can't know or understand. And that mysterious quality, separate from us, is what we should marvel at. All right. So here are some resources too. I believe that my slides are posted for everyone to be able to access. But if you have any questions, if you'd like a copy of my slides, if you want to continue this conversation in any way, feel free to email me. My address is up there. So thank you all for your time and attention.
Thank you to Dr. Kathleen Grant.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Oh, that's lovely. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, wonderful.
Oh,
And some
thanks.
Monmouth gear for you.
Yay,
Please
oh,
enjoy.
fantastic. Oh, good. Oh, what a nice bag, too.
Thank you.
Wow, wow.